The humid air over Tokyo shimmered with more than just heat on the afternoon of April 8, 1941. It vibrated with a desperate, anxious ambition. At the Nakajima Aircraft Factory, a small group of men in the uniforms of the Imperial Japanese Navy stood rigid, their eyes locked on the concrete runway. Before them sat an aircraft of monstrous proportions, a beast of aluminum and ambition. Its wingspan stretched nearly 140 feet, casting a dagger-like shadow over the tarmac. 4 massive radial engines hung from those wings, power plants meant to propel a dream across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. This was the creation of 18 secretive months. This was the G5N, codenamed Shinzan Deep Mountain. It was Japan's first strategic heavy bomber, built to reach out across thousands of miles of ocean and strike the heart of an enemy's territory. It was the material manifestation of a plan born in shadows and deception, a plan to steal a shortcut to supremacy. The engineers who had built it held their breath. The naval officers who had funded it clutched their hopes tightly. The pilot in the cockpit, a seasoned test flyer, advanced the throttles. The 4 engines roared in unison, a deafening promise of power. The giant bomber began to roll, gathering speed, its tricycle landing gear a novel and foreign feature carrying it forward. It lifted off, a leviathan rising into the sky, but it rose slowly, heavily. The climb was labored, a sluggish struggle against gravity. In the cockpit, the controls felt mushy, unresponsive, as if the plane itself was reluctant to fly. The dream was airborne, but it was already choking. This moment, this straining, struggling ascent, was not the beginning of a new era of Japanese air power. It was the culmination of a spectacular, multi-million-dollar failure. It was the punchline to a joke of historical irony, where the punchline was a bomber that could not bomb, a titan that could not fight, and a stolen secret that carried the seed of its own uselessness within it. This is not just a story of a bad airplane. This is a story of how the Imperial Japanese Navy, in a breathtaking act of espionage, purchased America's most advanced and most rejected airliner, reverse-engineered it down to the last rivet, and in doing so, meticulously copied not just a machine, but its very flaws. They built a monument to a fundamental truth. You cannot steal understanding. You cannot crate up the years of trial, the scars of error, the gut instincts of a test pilot, or the corporate memory of an engineering team. They bought the artifact, but the wisdom had been left on the shelf in California. To understand how this towering folly came to be, we must rewind not to a Japanese war room, but to a sun-drenched airfield in Santa Monica, California, at the very dawn of a different ambition, the golden age of the American commercial airliner. The year is 1935. The United States is in the grip of aviation fever. The era of the frail biplane and the daring, goggled pilot is giving way to something new. A national network of airlines promising speed, luxury, and safety. Luxury and safety. The Douglas DC-3 is about to roll out of its hangar, an aircraft that will become the backbone of this revolution, carrying passengers in relative comfort and, for the first time, making airlines reliably profitable. But even as the DC-3 takes shape, the men who run America's airlines are already dreaming bigger. They are visionaries like William Apate Patterson, the sharp-minded president of United Airlines. Patterson looks at a map of the United States and doesn't see a continent. He sees a route. A single, uninterrupted route from New York to California. He imagines passengers boarding in Manhattan in the evening, enjoying a gourmet dinner in a pressurized cabin high above the storm clouds, sleeping in a proper berth, and waking up, refreshed in Los Angeles, for breakfast. It's a transcontinental railroad in the sky. But to build that railroad, he needs a locomotive unlike any the world has ever seen. He needs a 4-engine land-based airliner. At the time, the very idea is borderline insane. 4 engines mean immense complexity, staggering cost, and engineering puzzles no one has yet solved. The only 4-engine aircraft in regular use are lumbering flying boats like the Sikorsky S-42, which rely on water for takeoff and landing. A land-based plane of that size and weight will need revolutionary landing gear, wings of unprecedented strength, and systems so advanced they exist only on paper. The financial risk could bankrupt a company. The engineering risk could destroy reputations. But the reward? The company that builds it will dominate global aviation for a generation. Patterson takes his audacious proposal to Donald Douglas, founder of the Douglas Aircraft Company. Douglas is a prudent man, an engineer's engineer. He listens. He is intrigued, but he is not reckless. He will not gamble his company on one man's dream. He tells Patterson he will proceed only if other major airlines share the vision and the financial burden. The pitch is made. And to Douglas's surprise, the industry answers. American Airlines, Eastern Airlines, Pan American, and Transcontinental and Western Air, TWA, all see the same future. They form a consortium, each putting up $100,000, a colossal sum in the Depression era, to fund the development of this dream machine. A $500,000 war chest is assembled. The project is greenlit. Douglas assigns his top man to lead it, Arthur Raymond, the brilliant chief engineer behind the DC-2 and DC-3. Raymond assembles a dream team of designers, stress analysts, and aerodynamicists. They are given a blank slate and an impossible mandate. The problems they face are legion, each a mountain to be climbed. How do you design a wing strong enough to support 4 1450 horsepower Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp engines, yet flexible and efficient enough for long-range flight? How do you stop an aircraft that might weigh over 60,000 pounds on landing? The braking systems of the day are utterly inadequate. How do you pressurize a cabin the size of a railway car so people can breathe at 20,000 feet? The metallurgy for that barely exists. How do you route hundreds of feet of hydraulic lines, electrical cables, and control cables through a structure that must also be light and strong? Every solution creates 3 new problems. The team works in a fever of innovation. They produce over 8,100 detailed engineering drawings. They build a meticulous wind tunnel model and subject it to 866 separate tests, racking up 1,100 hours of data. They are not just designing an airplane, they are inventing a new discipline of large-scale aviation engineering. For 2 years, the project consumes the Douglas plant. The prototype, construction number 1601, begins to take shape. It is a creature of pure ambition. They call it the DC-4E. The E stands for experimental, a silent admission of the gamble it represents. And when it is finally rolled out of its hangar in the spring of 1938, it is a sight that stops the heart. It is enormous, a gleaming silver albatross. It sits level on the ground thanks to its revolutionary tricycle landing gear, a first for any aircraft this size. No more tail-dragger stance. Passengers would walk on a level floor. Its most bizarre feature is the tail. 3 vertical fins, a triplicate arrangement born not from aerodynamic perfection, but from cold, hard economics. A single tail tall enough to stabilize the giant fuselage would make the plane too high to fit into standard airport hangars across America. The airlines refused to rebuild the world. Douglas redesigned the tail. It was a masterpiece of compromise. Inside, it was a flying luxury liner. Wide seats, sleeping berths, a galley, and provisions for air conditioning and that miraculous pressurized cabin. It was, by every measure, the most advanced commercial aircraft on the planet. On June 7, 1938, before a crowd of expectant executives and engineers, Douglas's legendary chief test pilot, Carl Cover, takes the control. He runs down the checklist, starts the 4 thunderous engines, and guides the behemoth onto the runway at Cloverfield in Santa Monica. The sound is apocalyptic. He pushes the throttles forward. The DC-4E accelerates, uses a mile of concrete, and finally, with a majestic inertia, lifts its wheels from the earth. It flies. For 45 minutes, Cover puts it through its paces. It handles adequately. But in his detailed pilot's report, buried beneath the congratulations, are notes of concern. It's heavy on the controls. It feels sluggish in certain maneuvers. The engines seem to be working very hard. The seeds of the future failure are already present, felt in the fingertips of the first man to fly it. The testing phase reveals more. The aircraft is a maintenance nightmare. Its advanced systems are finicky. Its fuel consumption is higher than predicted. Its range falls short of the transcontinental promise. Most damningly, when the airlines ask for more seats to improve economics, the weight creeps up past 65,000 pounds, and the already marginal performance sags further. One by one, the consortium airlines back out. Pan Am and TWA leave early for the simpler Boeing 307 Stratoliner. United, American, and Eastern finally deliver the verdict after extensive evaluation. The DC-4E is an engineering marvel and an operational disaster. It is too complex, too expensive, and too unreliable for daily service. By 1939, Donald Douglas is left holding the bag, a single, spectacularly unsellable prototype airplane, and $3 million of his own company's money sunk into its development. The DC-4E, the future of aviation, is a white elephant. It sits in a hangar, a constant, gleaming reminder of overreach. Douglas executives face a painful choice: scrap it and write off the millions, or find a buyer, any buyer, for this beautiful, problematic masterpiece. They quietly let it be known in industry circles that the world's most advanced airliner is for sale. They wait, hoping for a miracle. And on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, in the war councils of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a miracle is precisely what they are praying for. The Imperial Japanese Navy of 1939 was an institution gripped by a profound strategic anxiety masked by outward triumphalism. They had built a formidable fleet, dominated China's coast, and possessed arguably the world's finest naval fighter in the Mitsubishi S6 Me-0. But as their gaze stretched eastward across the immense empty blue of the Pacific, they saw a problem that warships and agile fighters could not solve: distance. The Pacific was not a naval chessboard, it was a void. To strike at the distant bases of a potential enemy like the United States, Pearl Harbor, Midway, even the West Coast, they needed a weapon that could project power across thousands of nautical miles. They needed a strategic bomber. A true four-engine, land-based heavy bomber capable of carrying a meaningful bomb load over oceanic distances. And here, Japanese aviation hit a wall. Their industry excelled at lightweight, agile aircraft. The Zero was a masterpiece of minimal weight and maximal performance. Their twin-engine bomber, the G4M Shinzan, would later be known for its long range, but achieved it by sacrificing armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, earning it the grim nickname of the Flying Lighter. The engineering philosophy of a lightness above all could not be applied to a strategic bomber. A heavy bomber required mass, massive wings, massive structure, massive engines. It was a discipline of additive strength, not subtractive minimization. Japanese engineers had no experience with their attempts on the drawing board ended in frustration. The aircraft were either too heavy to fly or too weak to survive. They were trapped by their own expertise. Meanwhile, intelligence reports and magazine photographs told a tantalizing story from America. Boeing had the B-17 Flying Fortress. Douglas was flying something called the DC-4E. The Americans, it seemed, had solved the riddle of the four-engine land plane. The DC-4E, in particular, captured the imagination of a certain faction within the Navy's Aviation Bureau. It wasn't a bomber, it was an airliner, which meant it was designed for the very thing they needed: extreme range, passenger or bomb, capacity, and reliability for overwater flights. The fact that it was commercial, not military, made it even more interesting. It might be obtainable, and so a breathtakingly audacious plan was conceived. They would not spend years and risk failure trying to develop their own bomber from scratch. They would buy the American blueprint, literally. They would acquire the most advanced four-engine aircraft in the world, strip it down to its constituent parts, learn every secret it held, and then use that knowledge to build their own weapon. It was the ultimate industrial shortcut. The operation was handled with the delicacy of a silken glove over an iron fist. The overt player was Mitsui Bussan, one of Japan's largest and most respected trading companies, with deep ties to American business. The cover story was flawless. Dai Nippon Koku Kabushiki Kaisya, Japan Airlines, was expanding its prestigious international routes. They desired the most modern, long-range airliner available to connect Tokyo with Singapore, Bangkok, and European capitals. The DC-4E, despite its commercial failure in the US, was still leagues ahead of anything else. The Douglas sales department, desperate to recoup some of their losses, found the inquiry from Mitsui to be a godsend. Negotiations were smooth. The Japanese were polite, professional, and surprisingly unconcerned with the detailed performance shortfalls that had scared off the American airlines. They asked technical questions, of course, but they framed them as matters of operational planning. The price was settled at $950,000. A staggering sum, nearly the original development cost from the consortium. For Douglas, it was a lifeline. For the Japanese Navy, it was a bargain. The contract was signed. But the Navy's requirements went far beyond the airframe. In a move of brilliant exploitation, they insisted, through Mitsui, on a technical data package. They wanted everything. Not just the manuals, but the engineering drawings, the stress analysis reports, the wind tunnel test data, and even the physical wind tunnel model itself. Douglas, eager to please the customer who was salvaging their disaster, agreed. They saw it as providing top-tier customer support. They did not see it as handing over the complete genetic code of their most advanced technology. In September 1939, as war erupted in Europe, the disassembly began at the Douglas plant in Long Beach. American workers, under the watchful eyes of a few Japanese airline technical advisors, carefully took apart the giant DC-4E. Every component was cataloged, crated, and packed with Excelsior into wooden shipping containers. The massive wings, the fuselage sections, the 3 distinctive tail fins, the complex landing gear assemblies, all of it went into the hold of a Japanese freighter. Alongside it went crates of paper, over 8,100 drawings, thousands of pages of reports, and the delicate scale model DC-4E used for those 866 wind tunnel tests. It was a wholesale transfer of knowledge. A team of Douglas technicians, led by John Piajaca O'Hara, was even contracted to travel to Japan to supervise the reassembly. They boarded a passenger liner, following their creation across the Pacific. They arrived in Yokohama with a sense of professional pride, tasked with helping a new airline launch its flagship service. Where a Japanese designer would use a single, carefully shaped spar and lightweight ribs, the Douglas wing was a robust, redundant structure, built like a bridge. It was heavy, but it was strong. They decided to copy it exactly. This was the fatal decision. They were copying the what without fully understanding the why. They didn't have Arthur Raymond's internal memos debating spar thickness. They didn't have Carl Cover's pilot reports complaining about sluggish roll response at certain weights. They had the physical manifestation of those debates and reports, frozen in metal. They assumed it was the optimized solution, rather than one point on a continuum of difficult compromises. The biggest challenge was power. The Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp engines were unavailable. Japan's engine industry was its Achilles heel. The brilliant engine designers at Nakajima, however, believed they had the answer. The Nakajima NK7, a Mamori, a colossal 14-cylinder radial engine still on the test stands. On paper, it was a monster, capable of 1870 horsepower, far outstripping the American engine's 1450. The Navy brass was thrilled. More power meant better performance, perhaps even overcoming the weight issues noted in the American reports. It was a classic case of matching an ambitious airframe with an even more ambitious engine. The design, now designated G5N, took shape on the drafting tables. It would keep the DC-4E's fundamental wing and landing gear. It would have a new militarized fuselage with a bomb bay and defensive gun positions. It would discard the triple tail for a more conventional twin-fin arrangement. And it would be powered by 4 of the mighty Mamori engines. They named it Shinzan, Deep Mountain. It was meant to be immutable, formidable, and awe-inspiring. It was meant to cast a shadow across the Pacific. In early 1941, the first prototype was completed. It was an awesome, intimidating sight. When the Navy inspectors walked into the Koizumi hangar and saw it for the first time, they felt a surge of pride. They had done it. They had taken the best of America and made it their own. The dream of a strategic strike arm was now a reality, sitting on its own wheels. All that remained was for it to fly. On that humid April afternoon in 1941, the man at the controls of the Shinzan prototype was not a civilian test pilot, but a commander in the Imperial Japanese Navy's Flight Test Corps. His name has been lost to obscurity, which is perhaps fitting, for his report would spell the end of a dream. He was a seasoned aviator, having flown everything from nimble carrier fighters to the twin-engine G3M and Nella bomb. He understood the language of aircraft, the subtle feedback through the yoke and pedals. As the 4 Mamori engines reached full thunder and the giant bomber began its takeoff roll, he felt the first prickle of doubt. The acceleration was ponderous. The runway at Nakajima's test field seemed to stretch on forever. He kept waiting for the controls to feel alive, for the wings to bite the air with purpose. Finally, reluctantly, the wheels lifted off. The climb was not a climb. It was a laborious slog. The engine screamed, their notes strained, but the altimeter needle seemed to move through syrup. The aircraft felt profoundly heavy, not just in weight, but in spirit. The ailerons responded to his inputs with a lazy, damped roll. The elevators required firm, constant pressure. It was like flying through mud. In the cockpit, surrounded by dials and gauges, he saw the numbers tell the story his gut already knew. The rate of climb was less than half of what had been projected. The airspeed, even at full power, was disappointingly low. And the engines, the mighty Momorus, were already showing signs of distress. Welder head temperatures crept into the red. Oil pressure wavered. A deep, worrying vibration resonated through the airframe at certain power settings. He flew a basic circuit, handling the giant aircraft with extreme care, as if it were made of glass. There was none of the aggressive maneuvering standard in a first flight test. The goal was simply to get it down in one piece. When the wheels thumped back onto the concrete an hour later, the atmosphere was not one of triumph, but of palpable tension. The engineers rushed to meet him as he climbed down, their faces etched with hope. He gave his report in clipped, technical terms, but the meaning was clear. The aircraft was underpowered, sluggish, and its engines were unreliable. The performance was nowhere near the specification. The dream bomber could barely defend itself, let alone strike a distant enemy. This first flight was the opening note in a symphony of disappointment. The flight test program for the Shinzan became an exercise in diminishing returns, a slow-motion unraveling of the Navy's ambition. Nakajima engineers, superb craftsmen, and dogged problem solvers went to work. They tweaked and modified. They adjusted propeller pitch, refined engine cowlings for better cooling, and tinkered with fuel mixtures. A second prototype was built, slightly lighter, with minor aerodynamic cleanups. It flew. It was marginally better. But a marginal was a universe away from operational. The core problems were fundamental, rooted in the very DNA they had copied. The airframe was simply too heavy. The DC-4E's robust, overbuilt American structure, which Douglas engineers had designed for a long civilian service life and safety margins, was a millstone around the Shinzan's neck. Japanese designers, masters of minimalism, had never encountered such a philosophy. They had replicated it exactly, not understanding that its weight penalty was its critical flaw. And the Momori engines, the great hope, were a disaster. In the rarefied world of engine design, producing high horsepower on a test stand is one thing. Delivering that power reliably, hour after hour, in the variable conditions of flight is another. The Momori was temperamental. It overheated chronically. Its intricate valve gear was prone to failure. The vibration issues were never fully solved. Most crucially, it could not maintain its promised power output for long. To get any semblance of reliability, engineers had to rate it, instructing pilots to run it at lower power settings. So the engine that was supposed to deliver 1870 horsepower and save the design was in practice delivering barely more than the old American Pratt & Whitneys it was meant to surpass. The Shinzan was caught in a vicious, inescapable cycle. It was too heavy for its engines, and its engines were too weak for its weight. Every flight test report added another damning line. Maximum speed, 261 miles per hour at best altitude, slower than American heavy bombers like the B-17, and a sitting duck for enemy fighters. Service ceiling, 24,000 feet on a good day, within easy reach of anti-aircraft guns and interceptors. Range, approximately 2,600 nautical miles with a bomb load, far short of the 3,000, plus needed to be a strategic threat across the Pacific. And the bomb load itself? To achieve even that pathetic range, the bomb capacity had to be slashed. The Adeep Mountain could barely carry a hillock. While Nakajima's team fought their losing battle, the world outside the Koizumi plant changed irrevocably. On December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. The Pacific War began in a blaze of tactical triumph. The Navy's focus shifted instantly to the proven weapons of the moment, the carriers, the Zeros, the torpedo bombers. The urgent need was for more of what was working, not for a problematic, unproven giant. The Shinzan program, already on life support, was now also an orphan of strategic irrelevance. Yet the Navy had invested too much money and too much face to simply cancel it outright. A face-saving compromise was engineered. They would abandon the Shinzan as a bomber, but try to salvage the airframes as long-range transports. After all, the original DC-4E had been designed for long-range, Perhaps it could serve as a cargo hauler. 4 of the 6 prototypes were dragged back into the workshops. Their bomb bays were sealed shut. The complex and heavy defensive gun turrets were stripped out, leaving only a few manual machine gun positions. The elaborate armor plating was removed. They were redesignated G5N Shinzan modified. The Adeep Mountain had been defanged and declawed, reduced to a pack mule. Assigned to the 1021st Kokudai Naval Air Group, a transport unit based at Kisarazu Airfield, they began a mundane, unsung wartime career. They ferried spare parts, personnel, and supplies to far-flung Japanese garrisons across the shrinking empire, to Truk, to Rabaul, to the Philippines. They were valuable in a limited way. Their long range was still an asset, but their operational history was plagued by the same old ghosts. The Momori engines remained unreliable. Maintenance was a nightmare as the complex American-derived systems required specialized knowledge and scarce parts. The aircraft were fuel-hungry, a critical flaw as Japan's oil supply dwindled. They were rarely all airworthy at the same time. The mighty strategic bomber, conceived to terrify America, spent its war carrying crates of rice and artillery shells, a logistical burden more than an asset. Across the ocean, the story of the original DC-4E's design philosophy was taking a radically different path. At the Douglas plant in Santa Monica, the failure of the DC-4E was a painful but profound lesson. Donald Douglas didn't fire Arthur Raymond. He told him to go back to the drawing board. The mandate was brutal: simplify. Take the core idea, a 4-engine, long-range transport, and strip away everything that didn't work. The triple tail, gone, replaced by a single, conventional vertical stabilizer. They would build taller hangars if they had to. The complex power-boosted controls? Simplified. The pressurized cabin for the initial model? Deleted. The troublesome Pratt & Whitney twin Wasps? Replaced by the more reliable, if less powerful, Pratt & Whitney R2000. Most importantly, the entire airframe was put on a diet. Every component was scrutinized for unnecessary weight. The heavy multi-spar wing structure was rethought and lightened where possible without sacrificing strength. The new design, which kept the DC-4 name but shared almost no parts with its predecessor, was what the original should have been: pragmatic, robust, and maintainable. It first flew in 1942 not as an airliner, but as the U.S. Army Air Force's C-54 Skymaster. It was an immediate roaring success. It was everything the Shinzan was not: reliable, efficient, and easy to fly. Over 1,100 were built during the war. They became the backbone of the Allied global airlift, flying the treacherous hump route from India to China, shuttling across the Atlantic, and connecting every corner of the front. A modified C-54, nicknamed the A Sacred Cow, became President Franklin D. Roosevelt's personal aircraft. After the war, the C-54 would form the core of the Berlin airlift, saving a city. The DC-4 airliner would become a workhorse for global airlines. The same basic concept, the American 4-engine land plane, had, in American hands, evolved from a flawed experiment into a world-changing tool of logistics and peace. The knowledge gained from the DC-4E's failure was the priceless ingredient the Japanese could not steal. It was the knowledge of what not to do. The final ironic chapter of the Shinzan was written by American intelligence. In 1943, reconnaissance photos from overflying B-24 Liberators, or submarines with periscope cameras, captured images of a large 4-engine aircraft at Japanese airfields in the home islands. Allied intelligence analysts in Brisbane, Australia, at the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit, ATAU, pored over these grainy images. They saw the distinctive silhouette: 4 engines, a twin tail, a long fuselage. They had no reports of such a bomber in combat, but its size was alarming. Following the Allied practice of assigning Japanese aircraft codenames, they gave it a woman's name, as they did for all enemy bombers. They called it Eliz. Operational reports were generated speculating on the Liz's range and bomb load, warning of a potential new strategic threat. Air raid precautions were reviewed. Fighter patrols were briefed to watch for this new menace. The menace was a phantom. The Eliza they were so worried about was, at that very moment, likely grounded for engine repairs or hauling sacks of mail to a backwater base. The Allies were preparing for the weapon the Shinzan was meant to be, not the lumbering transport it had become. Not a single Shinzan ever dropped a bomb in anger. Not one ever engaged an Allied aircraft in combat. By 1944, as the Allied news tightened and Japan's industry was pummeled by B-29 raids, the remaining Shinzan transports were cannibalized for parts, destroyed on the ground in air raids, or simply left to rot. None survived the war. The wind tunnel model that had once graced the Japan Airlines headquarters disappeared, likely melted down for its metal in the final desperate days. The DC-4E prototype, stripped to a husk by Nakajima's engineers, was probably scrapped years earlier. The physical evidence of the entire costly, ambitious, and futile endeavor vanished from the earth. The story of the Shinzan is often told as a parable of technological hubris, and that is not wrong. But to stop there is to miss the deeper, more human tragedy woven into its aluminum skin. It is a story of two cultures of innovation colliding with a wall of unshared context. In Santa Monica, innovation was iterative, built on a foundation of public failure and corporate memory. The DC-4E was a public stumble, but within Douglas, that stumble was dissected, understood, and became the bedrock for the C-54's triumph. The knowledge of failure was institutionalized. At Nakajima, innovation was expected to be linear and triumphant. The pressure from the Navy was immense. The timeline was compressed by impending war, and the cultural aversion to admitting fundamental error was strong. When the Shinzan flew poorly, the response was not to question the foundational weight of the airframe they had copied, but to tinker with its engines and surfaces. They were solving the symptoms, not the disease, because they could not diagnose a disease whose history they had not lived through. The American engineers had the luxury of knowing why they had made every compromised choice on the DC-4E. The Japanese engineers only saw the choices themselves, frozen in metal, and assumed they were optimal. This gap in understanding extended to the very men who bridged the worlds of earth and sky, the pilots. Consider the fates of the two primary aviators linked to these machines. In America, there was Carl Cox, a veteran test pilot whose career was a living history of American aviation. He had flown the first flights of the DC-1, DC-2, DC-3, and the DC-4E. His hands had felt the evolution of control forces, the incremental solutions to stability problems, the growing weight and complexity. When he flew the DC-4E and reported it sluggish, it was a data point in a long continuum. He knew what a good it felt like. He embodied the experiential knowledge of an industry. He would later serve the war effort supervising B-29 production, and though he died in a plane crash in 1944, his legacy was one of foundational contribution. A street at Long Beach Airport bears his name. The Japanese test pilot, by contrast, remains a ghost. We know nothing of his career before or after that fateful April flight. His report was a verdict, not a contribution to an iterative process. He was likely a skilled and brave officer, but he was handed a finished product, a fait accompli born of espionage, not development. His job was not to help shape it, but to judge if the Navy's gamble had paid off. When he climbed down from the Shinzan's cockpit and delivered his bleak assessment, he was not offering feedback for improvement. He was pronouncing a death sentence. He was the messenger of a truth no one wanted to hear, and in the rigid hierarchy of the time, that was a lonely and thankless role. His anonymity symbolizes the Shinzan's place in history, a dead-end project whose human participants were swept aside by its failure. The aftermath of the war brought the full ironic circle to closure. When American occupation teams, part of the Technical Air Intelligence Units, swept through the shattered remains of Japan's aviation industry in 1945, they were hunting for secrets: jet engines, rocket planes, radar. What they found in files pertaining to Nakajima were brief, almost embarrassed references to the Type 13 land-based attack aircraft and its transport derivative. They interviewed engineers like Dr. Kondo. The full story emerged: the purchase, the fake crash, the reverse engineering, the disastrous Mamori engines, the conversion to transports. To the American engineers hearing it, the reaction was likely a mixture of professional pity and grim satisfaction. The pity was for fellow engineers who had been handed an impossible task to leap a generation in technology with a stolen, incomplete blueprint. The satisfaction was the confirmation of a deeply held belief that the messy, democratic, and often public process of American innovation, with its tolerance for failure, was superior to the top-down, secretive, and result-driven model of their defeated foe. The Shinzan was entered into official intelligence reports as a curious footnote, a what-if that never was. Its greatest impact was not on the battlefield, but as a case study in the poverty its technological imitation. The legacy of the two aircraft diverged as absolutely as their design philosophies. The C-54 Skymaster, born from the ashes of the DC-4E, flew into legend. It didn't just help win the war, it shaped the post-war world. During the Berlin airlift in 1948-49, when the Soviet Union blockaded the city, it was the C-54 that became the backbone of Operation Vettles. With meticulous efficiency honed by its wartime logistics role, C-54s landed in West Berlin every 90 seconds, day and night, delivering coal, food, and hope. They were flying symbols of the Marshall Plan, of a commitment to rebuild rather than merely conquer. The aircraft that had been conceived as a luxury sleeper transport became an angel of mercy. Hundreds were converted into civilian DC-4 airliners, jump-starting global commercial aviation networks. They flew for decades, in every climate, under every flag, a testament to rugged, thoughtful design. The Shinzan left no legacy. No derivatives were built, no lessons from its failure were applied to subsequent Japanese aircraft, because its failure was so total and so rooted in its stolen origin that it was seen as an anomaly, not a lesson. Anomaly, not a lesson. Its very existence was scrubbed from public memory in Japan, a shameful and expensive mistake best forgotten. Only a handful of blurred photographs and technical manuals and archives testified that it ever existed at all. So, what is the final verdict on this tale of two airframes? It is tempting to dismiss the Shinzan as a folly, a joke of history. But that is too simplistic. It was, in fact, a monument to a very human and common error, the belief that complexity can be captured in a snapshot. The Japanese Navy saw the DC-4E as a product. They saw its physical form, its specifications on paper, its performance curves. What they failed to see was the process. They didn't see the years of argument in Douglas conference rooms, the wind tunnel tests that forced a wing redesign, the pilot reports that demanded a control system change, the airline feedback that rejected an over-complex cabin layout. They didn't see the intangible ecosystem of innovation, the free flow of ideas, the tolerance for mid-course correction, the corporate culture that could absorb a $3 million loss and pivot. They bought the fruit but had no understanding of the tree, the soil, or the seasons that had produced it. In their hunger for a shortcut, they skipped the very journey that makes the destination meaningful. The Shinzan was not merely a bad bomber, it was a profound misunderstanding of how technology truly advances. It was a copy of a blueprint that lacked the most important marginal notes, the ones that said, "This is a problem. Oh, we tried this and it failed, but this is heavier than we wanted." The story ends not with a bang, but with a whisper of forgotten aluminum. The last Shinzan transport probably met its end in an American strafing run in 1945, burning quietly on some remote island airstrip, or was broken up by hand for scrap in the starving winter of 1946. The DC-4E, its soul long since extracted and examined, had likely met a similar fate years earlier in a Nakajima scrapyard. Their physical forms are gone, but the lesson they embody is perennially relevant. In our own age of industrial espionage, rapid prototyping, and the relentless pressure for disruptive leaps, the ghost of the Shinzans as a warning. It whispers that true advancement cannot be stolen because it is not merely a collection of parts and data. It is a living continuum of experience, failure, and hard-won intuition. The Japanese bought America's rejected airliner, and in their attempt to turn it into a weapon, they accidentally built something far more powerful. A timeless, soaring testament to the fact that in the realm of creation, there are no shortcuts, only paths. And the most reliable path, however winding and difficult, is the one you walk yourself, learning from every stumble along the way. The deep mountain never flew high enough to cast its shadow across the Pacific. But the shadow of its failure stretches far longer, a reminder that the most critical component in any machine is not the metal or the wiring, but the understanding, deep, earned, and irreplicable, of why it is built the way it is. Let us imagine one final flight, not from the official records, but from the likely reality of the Shinzan's service. It is late 1944. The war has turned decisively against Japan. The pilot, a young lieutenant named Kenji, boards the Shinzan transport at Kisarazu Airfield. He is not a celebrated bomber pilot. He is a transport jockey, flying a plane his superiors regard as a troublesome white elephant. His aircraft is the least reliable in the unit. 2 of its Momori engines have been cannibalized from other wrecks. The paperwork for this flight to deliver a load of spare radio parts and medical supplies to the garrison at Iwo Jima is a formality. Everyone knows Iwo Jima is being pounded daily by American carrier planes. Getting in, let alone out, is a gamble. But orders are orders, are orders. As he goes through the pre-start checklist with his weary flight engineer, the scale of the aircraft still impresses him. The cockpit is vast, a cavern of dials and levers, many of which are now inoperative or labeled with handwritten Japanese translations over the original English script. Starting the engines is a ritual of anxiety. They cough, sputter, and finally catch with a belch of oily smoke. The vibrations are bad today. Something is out of balance on engine number 3. But the maintenance chief shrugs. There are no spare parts, no time. They will have to live with it. The takeoff is, as always, an act of faith. The Shinzan uses almost every foot of the runway, its shadow stretching long in the morning sun before it grudgingly unsticks from the earth. The climb is pathetic. It takes nearly 30 minutes to reach a cruising altitude where the fuel consumption becomes merely terrible instead of catastrophic. Below, the sea stretches, an endless, hostile blue. Kenji is not thinking of strategic bombing or stolen technology. He is thinking about cylinder head temperature on Engine 2, about the vague drift in the directional gyro, about the reported American fighter patrols near the island chain. His Shinzan, this a deep mountain, feels less like a weapon of war and more like a fragile, overburdened freighter, a sitting duck. He misses the agile twin engine, a Betty he trained in. This giant feels alien, a borrowed suit that never fit. He does not know its American origins, the boardroom battles in Santa Monica, the fake crash in Tokyo Bay. He only knows its stubborn, flawed personality. After hours of tense flying, navigating by dead reckoning through squalls, Iwo Jima appears. A smudge of smoke and sand. The radio is silent. The airfield is cratered. There is no one to greet them but the whistle of the wind. They land roughly on the pockmarked strip, deliver their crates to a haggard garrison commander who seems already resigned to his fate, and take on a few wounded men for the return trip. The takeoff from Iwo with a heavier fuel load for the return leg is even more harrowing. The aircraft staggers into the air, one engine coughing ominously. They make it back to Kisarazu on 3.5 engines, the crew silent with fatigue and unspoken relief. This is the Shinzan's war, not glorious sorties over Pearl Harbor, but grim supply, run desperation, a constant battle against its own nature, a drain on resources and morale. It is a symbol not of stolen power, but of a war effort stretched thin, trying to make do with tools that were never right for the job. Contrast this with the reality of the C-54 Skymaster at the same moment. Over the Himalayas, on the Hampa route between India and China, a grizzled American Air Transport Command pilot named Mike fights a different kind of battle. The weather is the enemy. Sudden monsoons, icing at altitude, jagged peaks hidden in cloud. His C-54 is loaded with artillery shells and aviation fuel for Chiang Kai-shek's forces. The aircraft is not perfect. It's loud, cold, and the work is brutally dangerous, but it is trustworthy. The 4 Pratt & Whitney are 2,000 engines thrum with a steady, reliable power. The controls are responsive. When he hits a patch of severe turbulence, the wings flex but feel solid. The engineering choices made in Santa Monica, the single tail, the simplified systems, mean his crew can perform minor repairs in the field with basic tools. The plane is a workhorse designed for abuse. It does not just carry cargo, it carries the certainty that the machine will do its job, allowing the crew to focus on the external dangers. Mike doesn't think about the DC-4E's failure either. He just knows the Skymaster gets the job done. One aircraft is a constant internal struggle. The other is a reliable extension of its crew's will. This operational reality, repeated thousands of times, is the ultimate judgment on the two design philosophies. The post-war reckoning solidified this judgment in the starkest terms. Douglas and its DC-4C-54 became pillars of the new American-dominated world order. Nakajima was broken up by the occupation authorities, its engineers scattered, its factories shuttered. The Shinzan was erased. But in a final, almost poetic twist, the flow of knowledge, which had once traveled eastward in stolen crates, now reversed. In the 1950s, as Japan began its miraculous economic recovery, its resurrected aerospace industry, led by companies like Mitsubishi and Fuji, which absorbed Nakajima's remnants, embarked on a new path. They did not steal, they licensed, they formed partnerships, they painstakingly learned. They built American designs under license, like the F-86 Sabre jet fighter, absorbing not just the blueprints but the manufacturing techniques and quality control processes. They sent their young engineers to train in the United States. They embraced the iterative, quality-focused, process-driven model of their former conquerors. The result, decades later, was not a flawed copy like the Shinzan, but world-beating original designs like the Mitsubishi Zero's spiritual successor, the sleek, efficient airliners that would challenge Boeing and Airbus. They had learned the lesson the hard way, that true mastery comes not from possessing a secret, but from understanding the process that creates it. The ghost of the Shinzan haunted this new approach, a cautionary tale that ensured Japan's second aerospace ascent would be built on a foundation of deep learning, not shallow theft. So what endures of this story? Not the metal long since recycled, not the engines silent forever. What endures is the principle. The Shinzan is a fossil in the strata of technological history, marking a boundary between two eras of industrial ambition. It represents the end of the idea that a nation can shortcut its way to supremacy by capturing the artifacts of a more advanced culture. World War II was the last war where such a strategy was even attempted on such a scale. The technologies that followed, nuclear weapons, jet engines, computers, spaceflight, were so deeply embedded in vast, complex ecosystems of science, engineering, and production that merely stealing a prototype was meaningless. The Soviet Union would try with the B-29, reverse engineering it into the Tu-4, but that was a final spectacular feat of a dying method, possible only because the B-29 was a mature, reliable design. Tacit knowledge. The kind that is carried in the fingertips of a veteran mechanic in the collective memory of a design team that lived through 1,000 small compromises in the institutional gut feeling about which risks are worth taking. This is the knowledge that cannot be digitized, cannot be photographed, cannot be crated. It must be lived. The Japanese operation was a masterpiece of acquiring explicit knowledge, the drawings, the specs, the model. It was a failure to acquire the tacit knowledge, the why behind every what. The Shinzan was a monument to this gap. Every sluggish control response was a whisper of Carl Cover's initial concerns the Japanese test pilot had to rediscover the hard way. Every overheating Momori engine was a scream against the absence of Pratt & Whitney's decades of engine cooling lore. The plane was a hollow shell, beautiful and imposing on the outside, empty of the vital spirit of understanding on the inside. And so, when we ask the final question, what created WWW-2 worst heavy bomber? The answer is not a poor design, though it was that. It is not bad engines, though they were that. It is not even imperial overreach, though that provided the motive. The answer is a cognitive illusion. The illusion that technology is a thing you can own, rather than a process you must inhabit. The Japanese Navy fell prey to the same illusion that tempts us all, the belief that the visible output of a complex system is the system. They saw the magnificent DC-4E and thought, this is American aviation prowess. They did not see the years of trial and error, the closed-door arguments, the tolerated failures, the culture that could write off $3 million and start again. They saw the destination and tried to steal the map, not realizing the map was incomplete without the traveler's journal that noted which bridges were out, which passes were treacherous, and which springs were dry. The legacy of this failure is not contained in aviation textbooks. It echoes wherever the quick fix is prized over the hard-won skill, wherever the product is worshipped over the practice. In every corporate boardroom that seeks to buy innovation through acquisition without understanding the culture that spawned it. In every nation that believes pirating software or copying chip designs will confer mastery, the Shinzan is there, a silent, cautionary monument. It tells us that the most valuable thing in any advanced endeavor is not the latest gadget, but the depth of the soil in which it grew. You can transplant the fruit, but if you don't also transplant the soil, the sunlight, and the season's rhythm, you will get, at best, a pallid imitation. At worst, you will get a deep mountain that cannot climb. In the end, the story brings us to a humble, powerful truth. Progress is not a commodity. It cannot be purchased, stolen, or seized. It can only be grown, nurtured by freedom of thought, tolerance for failure, and a respect for the slow, accumulative nature of real understanding. The men of Douglas, by stumbling publicly and learning collectively, built aircraft that connected and saved a world. The men of the Imperial Japanese Navy, by executing a flawless secret operation to seize a single, frozen moment of technology, built a bomber that could not bomb. The contrast could not be more stark or more instructive. The rejected airliner was not the end of a story for America. It was a crucial chapter in a longer book. For Japan, it was a dazzling, expensive cul-de-sac. The path forward for any nation or any person is never through the shortcut. It is through the long, authentic, often difficult road of building your own understanding, brick by brick, lesson by lesson, flight by failed flight. That is the journey that leads to true heights. The deep mountain remains where it always was, grounded, a testament to the fact that the highest peaks are only reached by those willing to make the climb themselves. The tale of the rejected airliner and its doomed doppelganger is now complete. The final word has been spoken, the last lesson etched into the record. The ghost of the Shinzan can rest, its cautionary whisper carried forward on the wind, a permanent footnote in the grand turbulent story of human ambition and ingenuity.